There was this concept in ancient language, mainly among Jews, rabbis, and all of that. We now call it today remez. I believe that's how you pronounce it, remez. But basically this concept would be as follows. If I were to be answering you a question that you ask me, and I were to quote a passage of Scripture, this passage of Scripture to the outsider might be like, why did he just randomly quote something that doesn't even fit into context? But it does, because the idea of remez is that I'm answering you through Scripture, but I'm not really meaning the Scripture that I said to you. What I'm referring to in broader context is the Scripture before and or after that particular piece of Scripture. So your mind automatically goes to this section instead of this little verse. Does that make sense? Okay. You can't answer me because you're just watching this. But there's something that I want to read to you in reflection of the passage that I preached on this last week about peace. I want to introduce you to another passage about peace, but I want to remez you. I don't know if that means what I think it means. But anyway, in proper context. But I wanted to read you this passage, but also go back a little bit in the previous passage and talk to you about the context of this. So, we're talking about peace, right? The idea of peace is often misunderstood, and I covered this on Sunday, but sometimes we think about peace as no fighting. You know, we're not fighting in wars, we're not fist fighting each other, we're not yelling at each other, there's no physical conflict. This idea of peace goes much further, though, and it was misunderstood even back then in ancient times when the biblical authors wrote the different parts of what we call the Bible. And peace to them was something that was a little bit scary. And let me explain. In the New Testament period of time, when we're looking at the time of Christ and the time of Paul, and we're getting almost into the 70s AD, late 60s, let's just say late 60s for now, there was this time called the Pax Romana. I've talked about this before. It was a time in which the Romans could record unprecedented amounts of peace. Peace, no fighting. Peace, everyone's getting along. Not really. Because the peace coming from the Romans was the thumb in the back. You say anything against the government, you're going to be beheaded or burnt on a stake. Basically, everyone was just to keep their mouths shut. And that was peace. And from the outside, actually, it kind of was. Because really, there was no fighting. There wasn't a whole lot of wars. There were some skirmishes here and there, but that's just common because where you get people, you get conflict. But now we're seeing something, Pax Romana, it's just unprecedented. Like, you can't record a major war, some little skirmishes, but that's it. But the people knew that this was an artificial peace because it was a peace based on rule, on oppression, on don't open your mouth or you're going to be executed, those kind of things. We see the crosses all over the place, crucifixions, we see burning at the stake, and so on and so forth. And then Paul is writing to these early churches, and this particular one in Colossae, the letter to the Colossians is what we see. And actually the letter of Colossians was also to another area, Laodicea, but we won't get into that. But this area, he's trying to talk to them in the midst of their quivering and being afraid of the government because it's getting intense with the amount of peace they're experiencing. He's telling them that you can have true peace through Jesus Christ. Let me read this for you. Verse 15 in chapter 3. So Colossians 3:15 says, "Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body," this is the unity idea, "you are called to peace, and be thankful." So he's asking us to be thankful with this peace. Could you imagine how that would have sounded if you used the word peace and thankful in the same sentence? So it kind of opens up something, doesn't it? But let's go before that. What does this peace physically look like? We're going to go back to verse 12. Therefore, as God's chosen people, you're it. You know, if you ask Christ in your hearts, you're the chosen people. Holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Oh, we're starting to get into the fruit of the Spirit kind of here, aren't we? Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these things put on the virtues of love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. This was so countercultural to what the word peace meant to them if they were heard out loud. I think that they knew what peace was supposed to be, but what they called peace was different than what Christ offered. Peace was a trigger word or a buzzword that now was being correctly purposed. Does that make sense? So he says, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. Rule. Rule in your hearts. Do you get it? Do you get what I'm trying to say here? That the peace that comes from Christ ruling in your hearts is countercultural. It's true. And if we allow ourselves that space today, we allow ourselves to dive into that today, we're going to see something amazing. It's different than what the world has to offer. The world tells us that peace is just keep your mouth closed and don't say anything. But the peace of Christ is unifying. It's not dividing. Well, I hope you learned something today. Have a great day.